Now I'm going to hand it over to Reverend Letter so that she can tell us what we're going to be talking about today.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for logging on today. I'm really excited about this webinar. I'm excited that we get to spend this time together, and honestly, I'm excited about what I get to learn from you as well. Hopefully, we'll be able to do some participatory things during this particular webinar. We've tried to set it up that way, and we'll be able to benefit from some group wisdom as well. I just wanted to offer a brief overview of what we'll be going over today. Sometimes, you know, the timing doesn't work out exactly the way that you think it's going to, but we'll start out with a template, with a roadmap, and then we'll see where we go from there. This webinar, Implicit Bias 101, What We Don't Think We Think, is actually, the learning engagements are actually based out of a workbook that GCORE has created, Implicit Bias, What We Don't Think We Think. That particular workbook is set up for preachers and teachers in the church who want to learn about and also teach small groups or other people in their congregation or communities about implicit bias. So these particular learning engagements, we'll be participating in them, but I'll also be talking through kind of behind the pedagogical veil, like what we're doing, why we're doing it, and some hints about teaching it in a small group. So you may be here today because you personally wanted to learn about some introductory ideas regarding implicit bias. You might be here as a preacher and or a teacher in the church, but we'll kind of go back and forth between individual reflection, ideas about communal, what does this mean when we do this work in a group, and then also some kind of behind the scenes teaching things or teaching hints for using these particular learning engagements. So hopefully by the time we're done in an hour, not only will there be some kind of big ideas that will come forward, some grounding kind of foundational things to hold on to with regards to implicit bias, but also some very practical learning engagements that you could then use and share with your folks wherever you're coming from. So as we disperse from this common digital space together, hopefully we'll be able to share this information with the folks that are in our particular area. So this particular webinar, depending on how timing goes, has 3 learning engagements, and each of the learning engagements is around a big idea. So there's 3 learning engagements and 3 big ideas. And again, these are pulled from either very specifically and exactly, or in kind of a compilation fashion from the Implicit Bias Workbook. Within the Implicit Bias Workbook, there are 3 categories. The first is recognizing implicit bias. The second is questioning implicit bias. And the third is transforming implicit bias. So the learning engagements and the big ideas that we'll do today are not blocked out specifically to those 3 categories, but those 3 categories will be part of our conversation as we move through it. The Implicit Bias Workbook itself has approximately, I did not count them, but about 25 learning engagements. And you'll learn more about being able to pre-order the Implicit Bias Workbook at the end after we have a couple of minutes for questions and responses. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Oh, thank you so much to Ariana Graham, who's helping me on the content side, moving slides, and she'll be helping us with the polls and the videos today too. So thank you so much. I thought today we'd start with an opening devotion. This devotion, again, is also in the workbook, but I think setting ourselves within Scripture and also within a theological framework helps us to understand why we might be doing this particular work in you know, not necessarily comparison to, but in relation to others who might enter into this work through a different entry point. Now, I know this could, we're starting to add in participants here. I don't know if is there anybody who would like to kind of unmute themselves fairly quickly and read the scripture for us? Do you think we could do that? Okay, I think maybe everybody's waiting for everybody else. So I will read these for now, but maybe we could kind of be on ready to determine if we could do some of this kind of participatory. I know it's hard with 40 participants at this point, but we'll see how much participation we can do. So the scripture for today is Luke 24, 30 through 32. Obviously, this is just an excerpt from the longer passage. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road and when he explained the scriptures for us?" Two people are walking down the road to Emmaus, deep in despair and disbelief. Jesus had been crucified, and we might imagine their hopes and dreams for a new day, a new life, and a new kingdom had been crucified too. Perhaps they were making plans for a new way of survival. Perhaps they were trying to figure out how they had been so wrong about what would happen. But we can imagine that they weren't trying to figure out whether Jesus was dead or not. Yet, after inviting a stranger to eat with them, they realized that the stranger is Jesus and that Jesus is somehow living. The one thing they thought they were sure of was overturned in the blessing and breaking of bread. They could have refused to pay attention to the way their hearts were on fire or the new way they heard the scriptures explained, but they didn't. They were open to what they thought was a closed subject. In this case, Jesus, present among them, helped them to see scriptures differently. Sometimes, even in the Bible, we're asked to rethink what we think we already know. Now, this, in the workbook, it has questions for response and also a section for notes. But Ms. Graham, could you flip to the next slide, please? Ooh, one slide back, please. Okay, so for the opening devotion, as an individual, if you can think for yourself, what is exciting to you about the idea that God is asking you to rethink what you already know? And then secondly to that, what concerns you about it? So if you have your phone next to you or a scrap little piece of paper or maybe a journal or a workbook that you were going to take some notes for this particular webinar, if you can just kind of jot down maybe in 60 seconds, so they don't have to be fully fleshed out or thought out, just what's coming to your mind? What's exciting to you about the idea that God is asking you to rethink what you already know, and what concerns you about it? So we'll take 60 seconds for that. Okay, that's great. This is actually the first question or first set of questions that show up in the workbook that you can do with the group. What is listed under the teaching area on this particular slide is that we do before we ask. One of the teaching principles that many of us use with preaching and teaching is that we would never ask someone else to do what we haven't done for ourselves. Part of the practical part of teaching is just that it's almost impossible to process and facilitate at the same time. So if we are struggling with or wrestling with or even just thinking through for the first time or some of the very first times thinking through some of this work, it's going to be very difficult for us to do that and to be present and facilitate for a group. So one of the reasons that we're doing this is so that we can model it. We're modeling it for when we do it later. We're participating in it so that we can start to process our own kind of quote unquote stuff with regards to this before we would bring it to a group, but also just to kind of practice it. So one thing I'd like to do is in the chat, in the Zoom group chat, if you could enter in a number from 1 to 10 and think about kind of a horizon. And the horizon would run from concerned to excited. So with regards to this, what is exciting to you and what concerns you about it? Now, as you may have noticed, we haven't even started talking specifically about implicit bias yet. We're just talking about the general idea that we may have to rethink something that we've already come to some sort of understanding about. Now, we've made a little bit of a complication with that because we've said that this might happen in the Bible and that it might happen about the Bible. So even though this may not be a concern for us, maybe we're really willing to kind of examine and even perhaps deconstruct things that we're reading in the text. For some of the folks that we will go back to, this could be a big concern. So from this horizon of kind of concern to excitement, where concern, deep, deep concern is 1, and amazing excitement is 10. If you could enter in a number that reflects how you feel about being excited or being concerned about the idea that God is asking you personally to rethink what you already know. So if you could do that in the chat box, and then we'll just start seeing folks' numbers come through. Yep. This is great. This is great. If you look in your chat box, you'll start to see the numbers come through. Yeah, these are great. Okay, somebody's got 30. Somebody's very, very excited. And we could imagine, just like we will have a particular group, with us in our context, there are all different ways that folks participate in a group, right? Sometimes you can, one kind of pedagogical technique is that you could have people write down their number on a slip of paper that all look alike, so that when you collect the slips of paper, nobody's paper looks different than anybody else's, and you just read the numbers out. So then that way, everybody in your group just gets a sense of where folks are without having to kind of identify if somebody is super concerned or super excited. So the communal aspect would be thinking about what kind of pushback, if any, maybe perhaps in your particular group you may not have any pushback, but what kind of pushback do you imagine might occur with bringing forth this information about, not even necessarily implicit bias, although you could use that. Just this idea of like, what is exciting about God asking us to rethink? Because the reason that we start with this is because we can't get to interrogating implicit bias without first interrogating the idea that we might have to change our mind about something. And more specifically, that God might be asking us to change our mind about something. That when we have ideas that we believe are already settled, even just the idea of some sort of challenge to that could bring about either explicit or implicit pushback. So just from the group, as you think about your particular contextual folks, your contextualized group, wherever you will bring this information, in whatever format you will do that, what kinds of pushback do you imagine that you might receive? And if you'd put that in the chat, in the group chat, that'd be great. Like a little phrase or a short sentence or something. And maybe if you don't think there's going to be any pushback, you can just say, my folks are going to be super excited and I'm ready to go. And there's nothing, no pushback here. Yeah. Denial, resistance, confusion. Doing this for knowledge and growth. Some denial, others anger. God never changes. We'll see what happens. Yeah, denial. That's not me. Political rhetoric. Pushback is low. My group is ready to get started. This is too basic. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, this is great. Can we, oh, good, some are still coming in. If you need to change, fear that you've done something wrong or been bad to this point. Not hearing or accepting the challenge to change, denial, tired of hearing about it. Yep. Excellent. Yep. I was trying to see if we might be able to, let's see. Yep. How about, let's see, I'm sorry. I don't know if I don't know if you are a reverend or not, so I apologize. Valerie Ohle, O-H-L-E, would you be willing to unmute yourself and just tell us more about your response as a 50-50 split between hesitancy or hesitantly embracing it and outright denying it? Would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh.
Yeah.
Do we have Reverend or Sister Valerie Ohle?
She said she doesn't have a microphone, but she's typing, I believe.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Sorry about that.
Valerie, you've been unmuted. If you could try.
Said I don't have a mic.
Yeah. If she's on a PC without a microphone, it's just not going to work.
Yeah. Would one of the folks who openly has their mic open right now, would you be willing to share a little bit more about what you offered? I picked the one person maybe that didn't have their, I apologize for that.
Well, I can read Valerie because she just wrote in the chat that her church in
okay.
Indian, she said, and a lot of them are more Baptist than Methodist in their beliefs. That's what she
said. Okay, yeah. And I think that would probably, oh, here we go. Some are more progressive in their acceptance of new ideas, most aren't. So there are some kind of socio-political and theological ideas and ideologies that are wrapped up in each other. So one of the reasons that I had asked her to kind of speak more to that is because sometimes one of the hardest things is trying to touch base with folks that are coming into this work in different ways. So I think that I've been talking, but I was muted. I'm so sorry. One of the reasons that I had asked her to explain more was because sometimes we have difficulty thinking about how do we facilitate some of these things if we've got different folks coming in from different entry points. You know, some folks are thinking, yes, this is going to be great. Some folks are having, you know, difficulties with it. And I think, and what either Reverend Ole or Sister Ole had offered was that there are some theological and socio-political kind of ideas and ideologies that are swirling around this implicit bias, and that that needing to attend to something theologically and socio-politically is going to be critical for those of us who are in the yes. So for figuring out how to enter in both of those spaces is going to be critical. That there's so as we start to think about theologically, where can we enter in? I saw somebody's response that said, like, God does not change. So how do we understand that God might be asking us to change something that we're thinking about without losing the idea that, like, God's justice doesn't change, or that God is reliable because God doesn't change. So not necessarily that we're going to be able to, like, answer those questions, but being able to address them in ways that are contextually important for your folks. Also, because we have this in the group chat, if it's important during the question and response time during the end, any of these things, if you would like GCORE to put together some sort of response or some sort of options for some of these things, we can take that and create kind of a follow-up resource to this particular webinar. So one of the things, so I'm sorry that took a lot of time to do that, so we'll be moving on a little bit. The teaching, we do it ourselves before we ask, but the big idea for this opening devotion is that in order to address implicit bias, we must be willing to question what we think we already know, because implicit bias is created within our brains in such a way that we would think that what those biases are normal and natural, and that they just automatically are, that they are already truths to be believed and values to be held. So in order to be able to interrogate them at all, we have to be willing to address this idea that we might have to rethink something, even something that's coming from the Bible. So if, Ms. Grant, could we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is the big idea number 2, but it's going to start with a poll. If you can look at the poll, there'll be a question that asks about a definition, and if you can choose the definition that you believe best fits the term bias. So could we move to the poll, please? Look at us all. Okay, it looks like we're having a little trouble getting to the poll. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and share my screen. And then we won't be able to see it in poll fashion, but at least we'll be able to. Ms. Graham, could you allow me to show my screen? This is just, you know, we do the run-throughs ahead of time and still sometimes. So let me explain why we're going to do this poll, or why we're going to look at these definitions. One of the things that comes up over and over again in any of the workshops that we do about implicit bias, about resisting racism and anti-racism, is the difference between bias, prejudice, and racism. And when folks have different definitions of those three things, entering into a conversation about implicit bias can get either convoluted, or the different definitions can start fighting each other. Now, I'm not saying that people start fighting each other, but the definitions will definitely fight each other. So people start having conversations at each other instead of with each other. Looks like, oops. Okay, can I get some thumbs up from some folks to see? Can you see my screen right now? Like a little thumbs up, so I know folks are muted. Oh, great, okay, I'm starting to see them. Okay, so here is the poll. It's just written in a text document. Choose which definition best fits the term bias. Beliefs, values, actions, and reactions to one person or thing based on what we know or think we know about a group or category. B is a system of policies, procedures, and practices that sustain and protect the benefits, opportunities, and trust of one race to the detriment of others. And C is a preference of one thing over and against another, or a commitment to one belief, value, or action over and against another. So if in the chat function, you could choose the definition A, B, or C that best fits the term bias. So just take a couple of seconds if you want to look through that some more. You know, the tricky thing is I'm going to have to come out of my shared screen in order to look at the chat. Okay, so we've got A's and C's, A's and C's, A's and C's, A's and C's. Okay, so with these three definitions, the answer is actually C. So the term itself, bias, actually is just a preference of one thing over another, or a commitment of one thing over another, a commitment to a belief or a value or an action. So the reason that I didn't even put implicit bias is because sometimes folks need to have just a definition of bias without all of the loading in it. So implicit bias already has enough energy around it and has been shared enough and has been talked about enough with regards to racism, sexism, other isms and oppressions, that implicit bias itself will generate a lot of different definitions for people in their mind that will be so much more than just the idea of bias. So bias in and of itself is just a preference or a commitment to one thing over another. So the example I use in workshops a lot is that bias, even implicit bias, I might go into an ice cream store and I don't have to try every single flavor of ice cream in order for me to know that mocha chip is my favorite. Now, you may have a different favorite and you may have an initial reaction to like, why in the world does she like mocha chip when she doesn't like my particular favorite ice cream, and that's fine too. But I don't have to try every single ice cream in order for me to know that I prefer mocha chip ice cream. So when we start with just the very basic definition of bias, it allows us to build on top of that. So B, a system of policies, procedures, and practices that sustain and protect the benefits, opportunities, and trust of one race to the detriment of others, is talking about racism, specifically systemic racism. So this may also be something that you would need to unpack when you're teaching about implicit bias, because some of your folks may be concentrating on individual expressions of racism rather than systemic racism. So when you start to talk about implicit bias and implicit racialized bias, biases that have been corrupted by stereotypes and prejudices, it will be hard for them to move back and forth unless they have a definition of systemic racism. And again, these are not the only definitions, but you could use these or other definitions that you that work well for you, as long as they're able to distinguish between bias, prejudice, and racism. So then A would be for prejudice. And even though we're coming from GCOR and we do work around racism and anti-racism, the definition that we use for prejudice is not specific to racism. So this allows us to be able to talk about prejudice and racial prejudice. And the difference between having a definition for prejudice and having a definition for racism allows for the conversation that all of us, any of us, can have racial prejudice. But only those of us who are white benefit from a system of systemic racism here in the United States and other places, but we're focused and concentrating here right now. So by being able to use these three definitions, actually, Ms. Graham, could we flip to the next PowerPoint slide? The one that comes after the poll. So the big idea number 2 is that even the term bias has a lot of bias loaded into it. So on an individual level, we all have biases, and we need to process through as many as we can, or the idea that we ourselves have biases before that we're going to facilitate. The communal idea is that when we're in a group, different definitions will fight each other. So by having these three definitions, and even just by having people choose which definition is which, will allow you to get an understanding of where folks are, what kind of definitions folks are coming in with. By separating the idea of bias, implicit bias, which is the bias that we're not conscious of or not able to articulate, and racialized bias, which is bias that that has a racial or racialized component to it. By separating those things, we can unpack the idea of bias and implicit bias. Now, again, this is not to remove our responsibility or to lessen our responsibility to address racialized implicit bias. This is only so that we can unpack it enough so that we can load it back up with the definitions that will be helpful for the conversation. If the definition for a systemic or different ideas or different forms or types of racism, moving from individual to systemic racism is a new concept for you or your people. One video to look at would be moving the race conversation forward. If you type that into YouTube, you will come up with a video. It's based on a longer deeply researched report, and it's less than 5 minutes and will help your folks be able to distinguish the difference between individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism. So again, the reason that we want to have these conversations and these definitions out in the open, and maybe even first before we start anything else, is that these are the definitions that will follow people throughout conversations on implicit bias. And unless they're pieced out, people will be having conversations using different definitions at each other rather than with each other. So because some of our technological difficulties have moved us beyond the time frame that we expected, I'd like to actually move on to big idea number 3 and see if we'll be able to play a video. So I'm going to start with this introduction, maybe while Ms. Graham works on trying to see about the video behind the scenes, and then we'll go from there. So this particular video also can be pulled up on YouTube. It's by Jerry Kang. It's a TED Talk, and the video is named Immaculate Perception. This language that you're seeing on the screen right now is actually pulled directly from the workbook and can be used as a script to be used as a script for your small group that you would use where you are. So introducing the video by just saying that so some folks are not going to believe in this implicit bias stuff unless there's some scientific background to it, right? One of the responses that came up early was like, this is just liberal propaganda, and, this implicit bias stuff is just, why are we learning about this when it has nothing to do with us? This video actually shows with scientific research and a bunch of different types of evidence and entry points for people that implicit bias is not only just real, but that implicit bias functions in our brain in a natural way. Now, again, we're talking just about implicit bias. We're not talking about racialized implicit bias. The normal and natural thing is just the neurological function of implicit bias. And this particular video clip does go longer. It's about 14 or 15 minutes. We're only going to be showing 6 minutes of it, and then we'll kind of press through some of the questions that can come afterwards. So again, you can use the script that's shown right on the screen. I think they're trying to pull up the video now. You can, Ms. Graham, actually, you can pull the video up. I'm going to read it from the workbook. So the script itself says so imagine you are a satellite audience. Now, again, I'm speaking also to you as a satellite audience. So we may not be able to hear each other participate, but I'm going to ask that you participate in the exercise when the video comes up so that you can experience it for yourself, just like we would ask the folks to do back home, wherever you are. So imagine that you are a satellite audience to this lecture. When the facilitator invites the audience in attendance to participate in the exercise, and you'll notice the exercise, it'll come up on the screen, and it'll have different letters and different colors. And he'll say, when you see this, say this. When he does that, just imagine that he's also talking to us. And when you see that, if you can participate verbally, so even if you're on mute, if you want to unmute yourself for this exercise, that's great. You should probably do it now before the video starts, just so you're ready to go. But even if we don't hear each other clearly, that's not the most important part. The most important part is that you participate just like the audience in the TED Talk, and then we'll talk a little bit about what that felt like, and different questions that we can ask our small groups as we do this in a contextualized version. So Ms. Grimm, if it's possible, do you think we could I see the video, so I'm hopeful.
So I'm going to start with an impolite question. Do you discriminate on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation? I mean, if you were the identical TED Talk, but coming from a white guy, would you like it better? Of course not. Why would you do that? We all remember the dream. We remember what Martin Luther King Jr. taught us, right? He said we're supposed to judge people by the content of character, not the color of skin. You judge people only on the merits and nothing else. We're colorblind. But are you so sure? So it turns out actually some people actually are literally colorblind, so they can't see that tile A is much darker than tile B, but most of us actually can see that. But it's actually an illusion. Just like a smartphone camera does autofocus and autocorrect, it turns out our brains do the same thing constantly. And when we do so, we usually get things right, but sometimes the shadows and the compensation for actual contrast effects gets things wrong. It's this understanding that maybe our brains are like our powerful smartphone cameras that can actually tell us a lot about how things actually work. So think about it. The real world confronts you at a brutal pace in real time. You can't but engage in automatic processing. So when I came out on the stage, what did your brains do? You autofocused on my face, you did some face recognition, and you immediately hashtagged me with multiple categories: male, middle-aged, professional, Asian. And then you stored that data in a mental cloud that you keep up here with all the other things that you have stored and hashtagged as Asian over the course of your entire lives. Now, a social psychologist would describe that mental cloud in terms of attitudes and stereotypes. Attitudes are like gut feelings, emotional valences of positive versus negative, like versus dislike, hot versus not, thumbs up versus thumbs down. By contrast, stereotypes are like traits that you associate with the category. So you already know I'm a professional, I'm a law professor. Once you put me into the category of Asian, you might be thinking, more likely than not that he got a perfect score on his math SAT. I'm Asian. More likely than not that I have a second-degree black belt in some ancient East Asian martial art. More likely than not that I was raised by a tiger mom who forced me to practice, not cello, but violin 6 hours a day, such that I performed at Carnegie Hall at the age of 16. 2 out of those 3 are actually true. Decades of research have told us that actually these attitudes and these stereotypes influence how you see me and how you behave. So if I want to know whether you discriminate, I actually have to get access to that mental cloud. I have to know what the junk is inside your head. Now, one way to do that is for me to just sidle up to you and ask, like, on average, sir, are African Americans more violent and criminal than white folks? On average, ma'am, do you think that women just aren't as good as men in engineering and science, whether they be 12-year-olds or 40-year-olds? On average, do you think Asians are really good at technically copying things but lack the creativity that we really so desperately desire in a context such as this? When I ask these further impolite questions, I run into 2 veils. First, even if you have attitudes and stereotypes that you're aware of, you're not going to tell me what you really think, especially when the cameras are rolling. Like, how many beers must you have drunk before noon before you actually tell me what you think? More disturbing is that you might have implicit biases, mental associations that you're not even aware of, these filters that come from culture day in and day out. And if you're not even aware of them, you're not able to self-report even to yourselves, much less others. And there's decades, again, of social psychological research that says, in a weird way, our brains are such ridiculously complex machines that we can't just introspect and figure out what's really going on. As Timothy Wilton says, we are strangers to ourselves. So how then do we measure these implicit biases that we might not even be aware of? Do we put you under hypnosis? Do we put you under an fMRI and take brain scans? What about something simpler, like playing a video game? In order to understand, I need you to participate. The rules are very, very easy. All you have to do is run down columns 1, 2, and 3, and as quickly as possible, ignore the letters, shout out the colors. So for column number 1, you would say green, red, purple, green. I need all of you to participate. Ready, set, go. Green, red, purple, green.
Blue, yellow,
It's a TED audience. I assumed it would be a little bit better. Okay, second time. Here we go. Ignore the letters. Focus only on the colors. Ready, set, go.
Okay. Green, red, purple, green. Blue,
Oh, yeah, you're screaming. So third time should be the charm. Now, I want you to focus only on the colors. Be blind to the letters as if Martin Luther King Jr. implored you to do it. Ready, set, go.
green, red, blue, purple, green.
All right. It's like being stuck in molasses in a winter January, right? So now you get it. Now you see it. The whole point is that any two concepts that are tightly associated in our brains, we can actually pair together very quickly. So when you see the word RED and the color red, we can sort them very quickly together. By contrast, when you see the word RED and the color green, we hesitate. It's like our CPUs are thrashing about trying to get the right answer. We're not stupid. We got admitted as participants in the TED Talk. Like, we should be doing this faster, but it takes a little bit longer. But that's the insight, right? That you could use the speed of sorting as a signal for how tight things are mentally associated in this cloud that we don't have access to. That is the underlying logic of the implicit association test invented by Tony Greenwald. And you sit in front of a computer and play essentially a video game. You're flashed, for example, on the standard black-white attitudinal IAT, pictures of white.
We can. Yep, that's great. Excellent. Okay, so the implicit association test that he brought up in the video, that's actually something else that is accessible to everybody. You can go online and type in Harvard Implicit Association Test, or IAT. All the information goes to Harvard researchers. All the information is anonymous, and they have multiple responses for people who have answers or responses to why they score the way that they do. So they have tests on race, age, all different sorts of tests that people can take. And again, once people take the test, then they get their results. And Harvard has already gone through all these different kinds of responses like, well, I'm left-handed, that's why my score showed the way that I did, or I grew up doing this, or I, thought about this, or things like that. So anyway, it's another way to introduce people to the idea of implicit bias. Sometimes it's easier after they see this video, because this video is a little more, has some more accessible entry points. So I don't think that we are able to use the polls, but I was going to do a poll that just asked yes or no only. When you got to the third screen, was it more difficult? Like, did you end up in the molasses in January when you did the third screen? So can you just answer yes or no in the chat? Yes, 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 yes. No, somebody had it. Yep. Yep. This is good. This is great. In every single workshop that I've done, the great majority of people, similar to the way the responses have happened in the group chat, have been that third screen is more difficult. And there have been different types of ways to do that experiment. Some have to do with language. So if you're doing that example in a language that you understand, it's harder. If you do it in a language that you don't understand, it's easier, because your brain isn't trying to force the letters and the colors to match up. So what this does is it just allows us to be able to say implicit bias is when we start to match up different ideas, different beliefs, different values, as if they always go together. This allows us to be able to say that the work, and again, this would show in the later portions of the video, but this allows us to put forward the idea that implicit bias is actually a very normal and natural neurological thing that happens in our brains. He talked about kind of the CPUs are thrashing about, that our brain takes in so much information at one time that we literally couldn't get anything done unless some of the time some of these things were put together for us not to have to make every single decision separately. The problem is that because we're socialized in ways that not only just have kind of base information that we can connect together, but also stereotypes and prejudices and racial stereotypes and racial prejudices, that the implicit biases then become corrupted by those socialized stereotypes and prejudices. The brain can't tell the difference between an implicit bias that's constructed on just a preference for, let's say, my mocha chip ice cream, and something that has been corrupted by a stereotype or a prejudice. The brain itself functions in the same exact way. And what happens is we understand without some interrogation of that, without some transformation of that, we then start to believe that whatever implicit bias is happening within us is also the same normal and natural implicit bias that's happening neurologically. So if we could flip to the next screen, I'm going to pick my dog up because he wasn't feeling good today and he's wondering why I'm not paying attention to him. So I'm sorry. Excuse me. Webster's now with us. Webster's with us.
Hey, Web.
Yeah. So the first thing is just admitting that all of us have implicit bias, right? But again, even in some of the content of our chat in the beginning, some folks are saying like, this isn't me, or this is something that's made up by people that don't believe in the same kinds of things or the same kinds of ways that I do. And one of the ways that we can help folks is by using different entry points. So these 3 questions show up in the workbook. Introductory just means folks that have never really been doing this particular work before, especially as it relates to racism. They may be in a denial phase of racism, or they may be in still in a very questioning mode. They just haven't had a lot of experience with sermons or teachings about race and racism within the church. These folks are just starting. Those folks would answer the question, what evidence was the most or least powerful for you and why? So what's next, folks, are the folks that have been doing this work for a while regarding implicit bias and or anti-racism work. They've gone to some workshops and things, but they're always asking what's next. They're unable really to come up with new strategies on their own. For those folks, they would start to work on explaining implicit bias to someone else after watching the video. And for your veteran folks, these are folks that have been doing this work for a while or are direct targets of racism. So with regards to racism, not necessarily implicit bias, but racialized bias, any person of color is going to be considered a veteran unless they place themselves in a different category, because regardless of whether or not folks have been to a workshop, they are resisting racism every day. So for the veteran folks, what implicit biases do you or does your church need to address? That way you're addressing different folks who might be in the same room using the same common information from the video. Can we just flip to the next slide? So again, we want to normalize the neuroscience of implicit bias without normalizing the stereotypes and the racial prejudice that corrupt them. The 3 major responses to the idea about implicit bias as well. You know, if it's a normal part of our neuroscience, there's nothing we can do. Others say, well, let's just eliminate implicit bias altogether. But those two things are really not tenable. But we can transform implicit bias when we start to take the time to recognize what it is and how it functions, to slow things down enough so that we can question and interrogate where our implicit biases are coming from and if they relate back to the values and the beliefs that we proclaim already for ourselves. And if we begin to transform them by making new connections. And there are multiple ways that we can do that. This is just kind of an implicit bias 101, but it is possible to transform our implicit biases so that we're not relying on those that have been corrupted by racism, but that we're actually reforming even some of the formative work that society, the church, our schools, government, our families perhaps have offered us that have created these implicit biases that actually rely on stereotype and racial prejudice in order for them to seem as if or be coded as if they are natural and normal. Woo! Well, with all of our technical difficulties that happened, we are at 1:59 already before we even got to our questions and answers. I'm wondering, and maybe I can get some group wisdom from some of the GCORE webinar folks that are on right now. Do you think, can we keep the group chat so that if people have questions, they can list them there and we might be able to put out a, like kind of a response email to those? Is that possible?
Yes,
Okay,
that's
so if you, yes, so if you've got a question, if you can type it into the group chat, we will make sure that we put a response in. I'm so sorry that we're at the 2 o'clock mark. I know Ms. Ariana Graham has a few things to say just about a survey and about the implicit bias workbook.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
I just wanted to let you all know, first of all, thank you everyone for attending. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Just wanted to let you know we currently have the implicit bias workbook available for pre-order. It will be available for download at the end of this month and available in print form in early July. But if you just can't wait and you're excited, there's a link here and we will also send it by email, so no worries about copying it down. It's on our website where you can fill out the form and we will have you on a list for pre-order. And once they are made available, we will be reaching out to you separately. So no need to write it down. We're going to send it out by email. And just lastly, we would like you all to take about 5 minutes, preferably sometime today after the webinar while it's fresh in your mind, to complete a brief anonymous feedback survey about the implicit bias webinar. Basically, GCORE, we use this feedback about our events in order to identify what works and areas for improvement. There is a link posted. Again, no worries about copying it down. I will be sending it by email. We ask that you please complete the survey as soon as possible. And the survey will be up and available until June 25th, which is next Monday. Other than that, thank you all for attending. And if you have any other questions, comments, feel free to reach out to us. We're always here to help you all out. Michelle, do you have any last thoughts before we close the webinar?
No, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I've just added my GCORE email address to the group chat, just in case you wanted to reach out to me directly. But you can also find me on the website. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for allowing us these 2-3 minute grace period at the end. Have a wonderful day.
Michelle, there are a couple of questions in the chat box. Alma Perez asked, would it be possible to have access to this material in different languages?
Ooh, Yeah, that's great. Let me, we're actually having a follow-up meeting about the implicit bias workbook being online. So as we're having that meeting, I'm also going to bring this up so we can ensure that we can do that.
Okay. I think that was the only question I saw.
Okay. I did also see the comment about the different prevening grades and sanctifying grades. So we'll also take that that group wisdom also.
Okay. All right. If there are no more questions, we're going to end the webinar here. I hope you all have a blessed rest of your day. And be sure to stay near your email where we'll be sending some important follow-up information regarding the webinar. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Take care.